My son-in-law looked at my faded flannel shirt and my worn-out boots, standing in the marble lobby of his brand-new high-end restaurant, and he leaned toward his host's stand and said, loud enough for 3 staff members and half the waiting crowd to hear, "Seat the old man near the kitchen." He thought I was an embarrassment standing in the way of his big opening night. He had no idea whose building he was standing inside. I nodded. I walked to the small table by the swinging kitchen doors, sat down alone, and ordered a glass of water. Then I pulled out my phone and made one call to a woman named Rhonda at a regional bank 40 miles away. 12 minutes later, that call set into motion a foreclosure notice on the exact building he had just spent $2 million renovating. Because 3 years earlier, when nobody in my family bothered asking me a single question about it, I had quietly bought the land and the underlying mortgage note out from under the original developer. He built his dream restaurant on ground that belonged to me the entire time. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me if you've ever been underestimated by someone who never bothered to actually look at you. Let's get into exactly how this happened. My name is Elmer Castellano, and I am 67 years old. I grew up outside Billings, Montana, on a small cattle operation. My father ran on leased land that never quite belonged to us the way we wanted it to. My father, Wade, worked that lease for 29 years, paying rent every spring to a landowner who lived 2 states away and never once came to see the property he owned. My mother, Ruth, kept the books for 3 small ranching operations in the county, working at our kitchen table with a mechanical adding machine long after everyone else had switched to something electronic. I grew up understanding, before I understood almost anything else about life, the specific difference between working land and owning it. My father worked that leased ground with the same care he would have given his own, and every single year, he handed a portion of what he earned to a man who had never once put a hand to a fence post on that property. He told me once, mending a fence line in July heat that made the air shimmer above the grass, "Elmer, the man who owns the ground always wins, even when he never shows up. Remember that." I was the 3rd of 4 children, and the quiet one among them, the way a lot of middle children end up being quiet simply because the louder personalities around them absorb most of the room's attention. I worked the ranch alongside my father from the time I could sit a horse, and I did reasonably well in school without ever standing out as anything remarkable. What I was good at from an early age was numbers, specifically the kind of practical numbers that mattered to a working ranch. I understood, without anyone teaching me formally, how interest compounded on a bank loan, how land value moved differently than cattle prices moved, and how a family could work themselves half to death every single year and still end up no further ahead than where they'd started, simply because they had never owned the ground underneath their labor. I graduated high school in 1976 and spent 4 years working full-time on the family operation, saving every dollar I could from odd jobs I took on the side, hauling hay for neighboring ranches and doing fence repair work through the winter months when our own operation slowed down. At 22, I made my first real decision, one that surprised my father and worried my mother. I took every dollar I had saved, roughly $11,000, an enormous sum for a young man in our circumstances at that time, and I put it toward a down payment on 40 acres of cheap, unremarkable scrubland 20 miles outside town, land nobody else wanted because it sat too far from good water access to be useful for grazing. My father asked me directly why I wanted worthless ground. I said, "It's not worthless forever, Dad. Billings is growing. Someday that ground is going to sit closer to something valuable than anyone realizes right now." He said, "And if you're wrong?" I said, "Then I've lost $11,000 and learned something important about patience." I was not wrong, though it took 19 years to prove it. I worked through my 20s and 30s, first continuing alongside my father on the family lease, and later taking a job with a regional agricultural equipment dealer, selling and servicing farm machinery across a wide territory in eastern Montana. I was good at that job for the same reason I had been good at understanding land as a boy. I paid attention to what people actually needed instead of what they said they wanted, and I built a reputation across the region as someone whose word, once given, never needed to be checked twice. I married my wife, Darlene, in 1983. She worked as a school teacher in a small town called Huntley, and she had the specific quality of someone who valued steadiness over excitement, which suited me perfectly, since I had never been an exciting man by any reasonable definition of the word. We had one daughter, Michelle, born in 1986, and she became, without any exaggeration, the center of both our lives from the moment she arrived. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters enormously for everything that came later in this story. I did not raise Michelle to value money in any particular direction. I raised her, alongside Darlene, to value hard work, honesty, and the specific kind of patience that lets a person build something real over decades instead of grabbing at something quick and temporary. What I did not fully account for, as she grew into adulthood, was how much the specific world she chose to move into as a young adult would eventually reshape those values into something I no longer fully recognized. Through the 1990s, while I continued working my equipment sales territory and Darlene continued teaching in Huntley, that 40 acres of scrubland I had bought at 22 sat quietly, generating nothing, costing us only the modest annual property tax bill and the occasional maintenance visit to keep the fencing intact. I want to be clear that I never forgot about that land, even during years when it seemed like the worst decision I had ever made. I drove past it periodically, watched the slow, patient creep of Billings' development boundary edge closer to it year after year, and I kept a private mental note of every new commercial development, every new highway interchange, every new utility line extension that inched the city's growth pattern in that direction. In 1999, at 45 years old, I sold that original 40 acres for a number that changed our family's entire financial trajectory. A regional developer, planning a large commercial corridor project anchored around a new interstate interchange, needed exactly the parcel I had bought 19 years earlier for $11,000. I sold it for $1.4 million. Darlene cried when I told her the number. Michelle, 13 years old at the time, did not fully understand what the sale meant, beyond noticing that her parents seemed different afterward, calmer in a way she could sense without being able to name. I did not change our lifestyle dramatically after that sale. Darlene kept teaching for another 6 years, until she retired in 2005. I left the equipment sales job and began, quietly and methodically, investing in commercial and agricultural land across the region, applying the exact same patience I had learned watching that original 40 acres slowly become valuable. Over the following 2 decades, I built what eventually became a modest but genuinely substantial land-holding company, never large enough to attract significant attention, but substantial enough that by the time Michelle finished college, our family's net worth sat comfortably above $20 million, almost entirely in land, and a handful of commercial buildings scattered across eastern Montana. I kept this quiet, not secret exactly, but quiet, in the specific way my father had taught me that a man who talked too much about what he owned usually ended up attracting people more interested in what he had than in who he actually was. Michelle went to college at Montana State, studied hospitality management, and moved to Denver after graduation in 2008, chasing a career in the restaurant and hospitality industry that neither Darlene nor I fully understood but supported completely, since it clearly made her happy in a way ranching or land investment never would have. She met her husband, Bradley Voss, in Denver in 2012, while working as an events coordinator at a boutique hotel where Bradley, at the time, worked as a sommelier and assistant beverage director. Bradley was ambitious in a way that impressed me initially, sharp, articulate, clearly talented at understanding the specific mechanics of high-end hospitality. They married in 2014, and over the following decade, Bradley built a genuinely impressive career, working his way up through increasingly prestigious restaurant groups, eventually becoming a partner in a small chain of upscale steakhouses across the Denver metro area. I want to be honest about something that developed slowly over those years, something I did not fully register until it had become an established pattern. Bradley had, from very early in his relationship with Michelle, formed a specific impression of me and Darlene, one built entirely from surface appearances rather than any real understanding of who we actually were or what we had actually built. I dressed the way I had always dressed, in worn flannel shirts and work boots that showed their age, because that clothing suited the life I actually lived, checking fence lines and walking property boundaries, not because I could not afford anything better. Darlene and I drove practical trucks rather than anything flashy, because flashy vehicles held no appeal to either of us and never had. Bradley, over the years, developed a habit of describing us, in conversations with his own colleagues and friends, as simple, salt-of-the-earth Montana folks, a phrase I overheard him use at Michelle's 30th birthday dinner, delivered with a specific undertone of gentle condescension that made clear he viewed our modest presentation as evidence of modest means, rather than evidence of a deliberate choice about how we wanted to live our lives. I never corrected this impression. Michelle knew the truth of our financial situation completely, since we had never hidden anything from our own daughter. But she also, I noticed over time, never corrected Bradley's assumption either, and I began to suspect, uncomfortably, that some part of her found it easier to let her husband believe what he already believed rather than navigate a conversation that might complicate the specific image of himself he had built as a self-made success story who had married into a modest, unremarkable family. The specific incident that changed everything happened 3 years ago, in 2022, when Bradley approached me directly during a family visit to Denver with a business proposition. He said, "Elmer, I've got an opportunity I want to run by you. There's a piece of land in the Cherry Creek area, prime location, that I'm looking at for my first solo restaurant venture, something entirely my own rather than a partnership stake in someone else's group. The problem is the capital required for the land acquisition, and the initial build-out is more than I can raise on my own right now." I said, "Tell me more about it." He explained the concept, a high-end steakhouse concept he wanted to call Ridgeline, positioned at the very top of Denver's competitive fine dining market, and he explained that the total capital requirement between the land, the building shell, and the extensive interior build-out would run close to $4 million. I said, "And what are you asking from me specifically?" He said, "Honestly, I was hoping you might know someone back in Montana, some rancher or landowner type who might be interested in a passive investment opportunity like this. I know this probably isn't really your world, but I thought you might have connections worth exploring." I sat with that request for a long moment, understanding exactly what it revealed. Bradley had come to me not to ask for my own investment directly, but to ask whether I might know someone else, someone he clearly assumed occupied a different financial tier than the simple, salt-of-the-earth Montana rancher he believed me to be. I told him I would think about it and see what I could find out. What I actually did, over the following several weeks, was quietly acquire the underlying land and the developer's mortgage note myself, through one of my own holding entities, structured in a way that kept my name entirely out of any documentation Bradley would ever have reason to review. I want to explain exactly how I structured this, because it matters for understanding everything that happened later. The Cherry Creek parcel Bradley had identified belonged, at the time, to a regional commercial developer who had acquired it 2 years earlier with plans for a mixed-use retail project that had stalled due to financing difficulties following a downturn in commercial lending conditions. The developer, facing mounting carrying costs on land that was generating no revenue, was eager to find any workable exit, whether through an outright sale or a structured arrangement that would let him recover his investment while transferring the ongoing carrying costs to someone else. I contacted him directly through one of my longtime attorneys in Billings, a careful, discreet man named Harold Ingram, who had handled the legal structure of nearly every land acquisition I had made over the previous 2 decades. I instructed Harold to negotiate the purchase of both the land itself and the underlying construction loan note, structured entirely through a holding company called Meadowlark Properties, LLC, a name that carried no connection to my own or my family's name whatsoever. The developer, relieved to find any workable exit at all, agreed to sell the land outright for $2.2 million, while separately allowing me to purchase the outstanding construction loan note from the original regional bank that had financed the stalled retail project, at a modest discount given the loan's uncertain status. This meant that once Bradley eventually secured his own construction financing to build Ridgeline on that land, he would be doing so on ground where the underlying mortgage note and the land itself both belonged entirely to me, without his knowledge, through an entity he had no reason to ever connect back to his father-in-law. I told Bradley, several weeks after our original conversation, that I had found a private Montana investor group willing to structure a land lease and construction financing arrangement that would let him proceed with Ridgeline without needing to raise the full $4 million in equity capital himself. I connected him, through Harold, to what Bradley understood to be an independent commercial lending arrangement, never realizing that Meadowlark Properties LLC, his supposed private investor group, was entirely my own creation. Bradley was thrilled. He thanked me repeatedly during that conversation, genuinely grateful, in what I believe was one of the few moments of authentic warmth he ever showed me directly. He said, "Elmer, I really appreciate you making some calls for me. I know this whole restaurant world probably feels foreign to you, but this means everything to me." I said, "I'm happy to help however I can, Bradley. Family takes care of family." He proceeded, over the following 18 months, to build Ridgeline exactly as he had envisioned it, taking on the construction loan I had structured through Meadowlark Properties, hiring an architect known for high-end restaurant interiors, and investing an additional personal capital contribution of roughly $1.2 million, much of it borrowed against his existing restaurant group equity stakes, to complete the ambitious build-out. Throughout this entire period, Bradley's treatment of Darlene and me continued along the exact same pattern it had followed for a decade. At family gatherings, he made small, pointed comments about our simple lifestyle, our practical vehicles, our unremarkable clothing, always delivered with a light touch that made direct confrontation feel petty, but that accumulated over time into a clear and consistent picture of how little he actually thought of us. Michelle, I want to be honest, occasionally pushed back gently on these comments, but never with the force I think the situation actually warranted, and I understood, watching this pattern unfold, that some part of my daughter had absorbed a version of success defined entirely by Bradley's world, a world where visible wealth and social positioning mattered more than the quiet, patient kind of building I had spent my entire life practicing. Ridgeline's grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday evening in late spring this year, an elaborate event with local media coverage, a guest list of Denver's food and hospitality elite, and a specific dress code that Bradley had communicated to family members weeks in advance, describing the event as black tie adjacent and requesting everyone dress accordingly. I arrived that evening directly from a property inspection I had conducted earlier that same day at a ranch parcel 2 hours outside Denver, part of an unrelated acquisition I was finalizing. And I had not had adequate time to change into anything more formal than the flannel shirt, worn jeans, and work boots I had traveled in. I walked into Ridgeland's marble and dark wood lobby at exactly 7 that evening, and I found Bradley near the host stand, dressed immaculately in a tailored charcoal suit, greeting arriving guests with practiced enthusiasm. He saw me. His expression shifted immediately, a specific flash of embarrassment crossing his face as he glanced around at the well-dressed crowd filling his lobby. He leaned toward the young host standing beside him and said, in a voice pitched just loud enough that I heard it clearly, along with at least 3 or 4 guests standing nearby. He said, "Seat the old man near the kitchen." The host, visibly uncomfortable, glanced at me and then back at Bradley, before quietly gesturing toward a small 2-top table positioned directly beside the swinging kitchen doors, the least desirable seat in the entire restaurant. I nodded, without any visible reaction beyond a calm, steady expression, and I walked to that table and sat down. I ordered a glass of water from a passing server, and then I took out my phone. I want to explain, calmly and completely, exactly what that phone call accomplished, because I think the mechanics of it matter as much as the emotional weight of the moment itself. I called a woman named Rhonda Whitlock, a commercial loan officer at a regional bank based in Billings that had, over the years, handled several of my land-holding transactions, including the specific arrangement through which Meadowlark Properties, LLC, held both the Cherry Creek land title and the underlying construction loan note that Bradley's restaurant had been built upon. I had structured that construction loan 18 months earlier with a specific clause that Harold Ingram had insisted upon as standard practice for any arrangement of that size. A clause allowing the note holder to call the loan due in full under specific default conditions, including any material misrepresentation discovered in the original loan application documentation. During Bradley's original loan application process, in a detail I had only recently confirmed through a routine document review Harold conducted as part of standard annual portfolio compliance, Bradley had listed his personal restaurant group equity stakes as unencumbered collateral supporting a portion of his personal capital contribution, when in fact, as it turned out, those specific equity stakes had already been pledged as collateral against an entirely separate loan he had taken from his existing restaurant group partners roughly 8 months earlier, a fact he had never disclosed to Meadowlark Properties during the underwriting process. This was not a minor paperwork oversight. It was a material misrepresentation of collateral, precisely the kind of default condition the loan agreement had been structured to address. I said to Rhonda, "I want you to proceed with the standard default review on the Cherry Creek note, effective immediately, based on the collateral misrepresentation Harold flagged in last month's compliance review." She said, "Elmer, are you certain? Once we begin this process formally, it moves quickly, and it becomes visible to all parties involved fairly fast." I said, "I'm certain, Rhonda, proceed." I want to be honest that I did not make this decision purely out of anger over a single humiliating comment about a restaurant seating assignment. That comment was simply the final piece of clarity I needed, after years of accumulated small disrespects, to finally act on a default condition I had, if I am being completely honest with myself, been aware of for several weeks already, and had been genuinely uncertain whether to act upon at all. Sitting at that small table beside the swinging kitchen doors, watching servers rush past me carrying elaborate plates toward Bradley's well-dressed guests, I made a decision I had been circling for weeks without quite committing to it. I finished my glass of water. I did not make a scene. I sat through nearly 20 minutes of watching the opening night unfold around me from the least desirable table in the building, and then I quietly left, before dessert service began, without saying goodbye to Bradley or drawing any additional attention to my departure. The formal default notice, prepared by Rhonda's bank and reviewed by Harold's office, went out to Bradley and to his restaurant group's legal counsel the following Tuesday morning, exactly 3 days after Ridgeland's opening night. I learned through Michelle exactly how that Tuesday unfolded for Bradley. He received the notice by certified mail at his restaurant group's corporate office, and according to Michelle, he called her immediately, in what she described as a state of genuine panic she had rarely witnessed from him before. He told her the building's construction loan had been called due in full, citing a collateral discrepancy from his original application, and that the notice referenced Meadowlark Properties, LLC, as the note holder initiating the action. Michelle, who had grown up understanding our family's land holdings far more completely than her husband ever had, recognized the entity name immediately. She called me that same afternoon. She said, "Dad, is Meadowlark Properties yours?" I said, "It is, Michelle." She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "You own the land under Ridgeline. You've owned it this entire time." I said, "I do. I have since before Bradley ever broke ground on that building." She said, "Why didn't you tell him? Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I wanted to help him build something real, Michelle, and I understood that if he knew the money and the land came from me directly, it would change how he approached the entire project, probably not for the better. I wanted him to build it as his own accomplishment. I never expected to need to use the arrangement the way I'm using it now." She said, "And now?" I said, "Now, I think it's time your husband understood exactly who he's been disrespecting for the last 10 years. The days following that Tuesday notice unfolded quickly, in the specific compressed way that serious financial consequences often do once the formal machinery of a default proceeding begins moving. Bradley's restaurant group attorney contacted Harold's office within 24 hours, attempting to negotiate an extension or a renegotiation of the loan terms, initially unaware of exactly who stood behind Meadowlark Properties, LLC. Harold, following my explicit instructions, remained entirely professional and non-committal during these initial conversations, simply confirming that the note holder was prepared to proceed with foreclosure unless the collateral misrepresentation issue was resolved satisfactorily and the loan brought current under revised terms. Bradley called me directly on Thursday evening, 3 days after the notice went out, his voice carrying a specific strained quality I had never heard from him before. He said, "Elmer, I need your help. Something's happened with the building's financing, and I don't fully understand it yet, but it looks serious." I said, "Tell me what you know." He explained the situation, the collateral misrepresentation finding, the default notice, the threat of foreclosure, and he asked, somewhat desperately, whether I might know anyone who could help him understand what Meadowlark Properties actually wanted, or potentially help him negotiate a resolution. I let him finish completely before I responded. I said, "Bradley, Meadowlark Properties is mine. I've owned the Cherry Creek land and the construction note on your building since before you ever broke ground." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I genuinely wondered whether the call had dropped. He said eventually, "That's not possible. My investor group was independent. Harold set that up as a separate arrangement." I said, "Harold works for me, Bradley. He has for over 20 years. I asked him to structure the land purchase and the note acquisition in a way that would let you build this restaurant believing you'd found independent financing, because I wanted you to build something you could genuinely call your own." He said, "Why would you do that and then do this to me now?" I said, "I didn't do anything to you, Bradley, beyond enforcing a standard default clause after discovering you misrepresented your collateral during the original loan underwriting. That misrepresentation is entirely your own doing, not mine." He was quiet again, and then he said something that told me he had, at least in that moment, begun to genuinely understand the situation. He said, "This is about Saturday night, isn't it? The seating comment." I said, "The seating comment told me something true about how you actually see me, Bradley. Something I'd suspected for a long time but never had complete confirmation of until that exact moment. But I want to be honest with you. The default action itself isn't punishment for an insult. It's simply the accurate consequence of a real misrepresentation in your loan paperwork. One Herald's office was already required to flag under standard compliance review, regardless of anything that happened at your opening night." He said, "So if I hadn't said that thing to the host, would you still have called the loan?" I said, "I honestly don't know, Bradley. I've been sitting with that compliance flag for several weeks, genuinely uncertain whether to act on it, hoping we could resolve it quietly instead. What I do know is that watching you tell your staff to seat me near the kitchen removed any remaining hesitation I had about protecting my own interests instead of continuing to protect yours." We spoke for a while longer that evening, and I want to be honest that the conversation was not entirely without warmth, even given everything that had happened. Bradley, to his credit, did not spend the remainder of that call arguing or deflecting. He asked, directly, what path forward might exist that would let him keep the restaurant he had poured himself into building. I told him the truth. I had no interest in destroying Ridgeline itself, or in taking the restaurant away from him entirely, since I understood, underneath everything, that he had built something genuinely skilled and worth preserving. What I wanted was an entirely renegotiated arrangement, one built on complete transparency rather than the layered deception the original structure had accidentally created, and one that finally required him to acknowledge, honestly, both to himself and to our family, exactly whose foundation his success had actually been built upon. Over the following 6 weeks, Harold and Bradley's attorney worked out a revised agreement. The default action was resolved, the loan restructured under terms that reflected Bradley's actual financial position, honestly rather than the misrepresented collateral from his original application, and Meadowlark Properties LLC's ownership of the underlying land was formally disclosed to Bradley directly, with my name attached to the entity for the first time. Ridgeline remains open today, under Bradley's continued operational leadership, though the ownership structure underneath it now reflects something closer to an honest partnership than the arrangement he originally believed he had built entirely on his own. Bradley has, in the months since, made a genuine and consistent effort to change how he treats Darlene and me, though I remain, understandably, more cautious about fully trusting that change than I might have been before that Saturday evening. Michelle has been more direct with her husband than I had ever seen her be before, telling him plainly that the way he had spoken to me at his own opening night reflected something about his character that needed real, sustained correction, rather than a single embarrassed apology. I think often about that small table beside the swinging kitchen doors, and about the specific stillness I felt sitting there that evening, watching well-dressed guests move past me toward tables Bradley considered worthy of his attention. I did not feel rage in that moment, though I understand why people might assume I did. I felt something closer to clarity, the specific settling feeling of finally seeing something clearly that I had allowed myself to look past for years, out of love for my daughter and a genuine hope that her husband might eventually grow into someone who valued substance over appearance. I have built almost everything in my life slowly, patiently, the way my father taught me to think about land itself, understanding that real value rarely announces itself loudly, and that the people who dismiss quiet, unremarkable appearances too quickly often end up standing, without realizing it, on ground that belongs to someone they never bothered to actually see. Bradley did not lose his restaurant. He lost something else that evening, a specific illusion he had built for himself about exactly where his success actually came from, and about exactly who had been quietly making that success possible the entire time. I hope genuinely that what happened over these past months makes him a better husband to my daughter, and eventually, a better man overall. I have seen enough real change in him these past weeks to hold onto that hope carefully, without yet handing it my full trust. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments about a time someone underestimated you because of how you looked, and what happened when the truth finally came out. Subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell, because every week I bring you a story like this one, real and worth every minute of your time. I read every single comment. Thank you for being here.